The first time my daughter mocked me, I brushed it off as youthful arrogance. She was still in her 20s, fiery, ambitious, and self-assured. She believed the world revolved around her dreams, and that her vision was more important than my years of sacrifice. But I never expected her disdain would grow into something so sharp, so cruel, that it would cut me deeper than any stranger's insult ever could. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with the time where you are now. The worst of it came on the day we stood together at the beach house. It wasn't just any house, it was a place I had poured sweat, money, and heart into building. A place where I imagined we would one day gather as a family, share holidays, watch the ocean together, and pass down memories through generations. But to her, it was only a symbol of ownership, a trophy she believed she was entitled to. "You really think you deserve this, Dad?" she said, her lips curled into a mocking smile. "You've wasted your life chasing little things. Look at me, I built my life bigger than yours. This house? It's mine. Everyone knows I'm the one who can actually make use of it." Her words stung. She didn't even hide the disdain in her voice. She said it loudly, in front of her husband, her friends, even some of my own family members. I stood there, humiliated, clutching the railing of the balcony while she laughed. The salty breeze carried her laughter across the ocean like it was meant to echo in my ears forever. Inside, I was boiling. I had always been patient, had always told myself to forgive her immaturity. But at that moment, something inside me broke. I realized she didn't see me as her father anymore. She saw me as weak, as useless, as a man she could walk over while she paraded around, claiming my achievements as hers. But she forgot one thing. That house was still mine. I had built it, I had sacrificed for it, and my name was on the papers. That night, I sat alone in the living room of the beach house, staring at the flickering lights outside as waves crashed against the shore. My heart was heavy, not just with anger, but with sorrow. How had my little girl, the one I had carried in my arms and promised the world to, grown into this person who mocked me like a stranger? And then a thought struck me. If she truly believed I was worthless, if she truly thought she had already won, maybe it was time to remind her where everything she stood on had come from. The next morning I called my lawyer. "Are you sure?" he asked, surprised at my decision. "This is the beach house you always said you wanted to pass down to your family." "Yes," I said firmly, "but not to someone who mocks me. If she wants to laugh at me, let her laugh without it, sell it. Every brick, every window, every view of the ocean, I want it gone. And I don't want her name anywhere near it." The papers were drawn up within weeks. And when the sale was finalized, I didn't just feel relief. I felt power. For once, I wasn't the father being mocked, overlooked, or dismissed. I was the man who made the final decision. When I told my daughter the news, her laughter stopped. The smirk disappeared. She screamed, she cried, she accused me of betrayal, of cruelty, of destroying her future. But I stood there quietly, watching the realization dawn in her eyes. The beach house wasn't hers. It was never hers, and I had taken it away with a single stroke of a pen. If you've ever been underestimated, humiliated, or mocked by someone who thought they were above you, you'll understand why I did it. Because sometimes love isn't about giving endlessly. Sometimes love is about teaching a lesson that words alone cannot deliver. This wasn't the end of the story. Far from it. My daughter didn't take her loss lightly, and the battle that followed between us would tear open wounds neither of us expected. But in that moment, on that day, I discovered something important, that respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned. And when it's gone, no dream house, no ocean view, and no inheritance can bring it back. This is the story of how my daughter's mockery turned into her greatest regret, and why the day I sold her dream beach house changed everything. When the words left my mouth that the beach house had been sold, my daughter's face twisted into something I had never seen before. Her eyes went wide, her lips trembled, and then the anger exploded. "You did what?" She screamed, her voice sharp enough to make her husband flinch beside her. "I sold it," I said calmly. "The beach house is gone. It doesn't belong to this family anymore." She laughed, but it was hollow, broken. "No, no, no! You didn't, you couldn't. That house was mine, Dad, mine. You knew how much I wanted it. You knew it was my dream." I didn't flinch. For years I had bent every time she raised her voice. I had surrendered, compromised, given in, because I thought that's what fathers do for their children. But not this time. This time I stood my ground. Her husband stepped in, trying to calm her, but she shoved him aside. "Do you realize what you've done?" she hissed. "You've ruined me. Everyone knew I was getting that house. My friends, my colleagues, they all knew. It was supposed to be my legacy. And now, because of your pathetic need for control, it's gone." Her words were like knives. Pathetic. Control. She didn't see me as her father anymore. She saw me as an obstacle, someone to step on to elevate herself. I tried to keep my voice steady. "That house was never yours. You mocked me in front of our family, in front of strangers. You disrespected everything I've worked for. Why should I hand over something so precious to someone who looks down on me?" Her eyes narrowed, and I saw something shift in her expression. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was vengeance. "You think you've won, don't you?" she whispered, almost smiling. "But you've just made the biggest mistake of your life. You can't embarrass me like this. You can't humiliate me and walk away. I'll make sure you regret it." I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't the little girl I had raised. This wasn't the daughter who used to run into my arms after school or beg me to tuck her in at night. This was a woman consumed by pride and greed, and I realized in that moment she wasn't just angry, she was dangerous. Over the next few weeks, her fury turned into action. She stopped visiting me, stopped calling, but I knew better than to think she had given up. The silence wasn't peace, it was preparation. I started hearing things from mutual friends. She was telling anyone who would listen that I had betrayed her, that I was senile, unfit to handle property, that I was destroying the family's future out of spite. She painted herself as the victim, the poor daughter whose cruel father had taken everything from her, and people believed her. I noticed the stares at church, the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Even my own relatives started calling me, questioning why I had done it. Some begged me to reconsider, as if the deed wasn't already finalized. Others accused me of being heartless. She was clever. She knew how to twist the story. And in the court of public opinion, she was winning. But what she didn't know was that I had anticipated her moves. When I sold the beach house, I didn't just do it to hurt her pride. I did it to protect myself, because deep down, I knew if I left that house in her hands, she would destroy more than just the walls and windows. She would destroy me, so I stayed quiet. I let her dig deeper, let her spin her web of lies, let her believe she was untouchable, because when the time came, the truth would be louder than her whispers. One evening, I received a letter from my lawyer. Inside was a notice. My daughter had tried to contest the sale. She had filed a claim, arguing that I was not in the right state of mind when I sold the house, that I had acted irrationally, recklessly, maybe even under the influence. She wanted to drag me into court. I sat there, holding the letter in my hands, my heart pounding. My own daughter, my flesh and blood, was willing to paint me as a broken, senile old man just to get her hands on what she thought was hers. It was a betrayal so deep it almost broke me. Almost. But then I remembered her words. "You can't humiliate me," and walk away. "I'll make sure you regret it." She thought she was setting a trap for me. What she didn't realize was that I had already prepared mine. And when the day came to face her in court, I wasn't going to walk in alone. I was going to bring the one person who could shatter every lie she had built, my lawyer. The day of the hearing arrived faster than I could have ever imagined. I woke before dawn, my chest heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. As I stood in front of the mirror, fastening the last button of my shirt, I caught my reflection staring back at me, an exhausted man who never thought fatherhood would lead him here, into a courtroom battle against his own blood. My daughter's voice echoed in my mind, sharp and venomous. "You can't humiliate me and walk away. I'll make sure you regret it." Her promise of revenge had finally materialized. When I walked through the courthouse doors, the air itself felt different, stiff, heavy, buzzing with unspoken tension. And there she was, my daughter. She sat near the front with her husband, dressed immaculately as if she were the wronged party, her chin lifted high in defiance. She didn't look at me like a daughter should look at her father. She looked at me like a rival, her eyes locked on mine with a glare that carried both hatred and triumph. She leaned slightly toward her husband and whispered something that made him smirk. It was as if they believed they had already won. In her mind, I wasn't just her father anymore. I was her obstacle, an old man she intended to bulldoze over, even if it meant destroying the last fragments of our relationship. My lawyer, Mr. Charles, placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. He was a calm man, seasoned, with decades of experience in cases nastier than this one. "Remember," he said quietly, "she has emotion. We have evidence. Sit tight and don't let her rattle you." The bailiff called for order, and the room settled. The judge entered, stern and unreadable, his robe sweeping the floor as he took his seat. My daughter's attorney rose immediately, wasting no time. He painted a picture of me as an unstable, bitter old man, someone too clouded by spite to make rational decisions. He spoke about my daughter's years of dedication to the family, her sacrifice, and how cruel it was for me to sell what had always been promised to her. I listened in silence as he spun his story, turning my daughter into the victim and me into the villain. Each word was like acid dripping into my ears. But worse than the lies was the look on my daughter's face as she listened. She wasn't ashamed. She wasn't horrified at dragging her own father through the mud. She was proud. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, like she was savoring every word. When it was her turn to speak, she stood gracefully, her voice trembling in carefully rehearsed emotion. "My father," she began, "hasn't been himself for years. I love him, but he's been making rash decisions, driven by anger and resentment. That house wasn't just a building to me. It was a promise, a part of our family. But instead of keeping that promise, he decided to humiliate me, to take away everything I've worked for." She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she didn't need. "I'm just trying to protect what's rightfully mine," the courtroom murmured, and for a moment I felt the weight of judgment pressing against me. I wanted to shout, to stand and defend myself, to remind everyone of the nights I stayed awake, working 2 jobs to put her through college, of the sacrifices I made to ensure she never lacked anything. But my lawyer's earlier words kept me grounded. "We have evidence." Finally, it was our turn. Mr. Charles stood slowly, deliberately, and steadily, as though the entire performance from my daughter's side had barely scratched him. "Your Honor," he began, "what my client's daughter calls a promise was nothing more than entitlement. The beach house was never hers. It was his, and the decision to sell it was his right. This is not about family legacy. This is about greed, and we will show you proof." He called for the documents, the deed, the sale agreements, medical records, and financial statements. Everything was laid bare. The sale had been clean, legal, and uncontested at the time of signing. There was no evidence of mental instability. My lawyer presented doctor's notes, affirming my clear health, both physical and mental, at the time of sale. And then came the final blow, the testimony of a witness. The very real estate agent who had closed the deal, confirming that I had been sharp, rational, and entirely deliberate in my choice. As each piece of evidence stacked up, I watched the confidence drain from my daughter's face. Her smug smile faltered, her lips pressed tight, her eyes darting nervously between her lawyer and the judge. The strong facade she had so carefully constructed was beginning to crack. Her husband leaned close, whispering fiercely, but I could see it in her eyes. Panic. This wasn't going the way she planned. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a surge of strength. Not triumph, not yet, but hope. She had underestimated me. She thought she could twist me into a caricature of weakness. She thought her lies could bury me. But she had forgotten one thing. I had lived through a lifetime of struggle, sacrifice, and survival. And unlike her, I didn't need to lie to prove my worth. The judge leaned back in his chair, silent for a long moment. The room seemed to hold its breath. My daughter shifted uncomfortably, the confident mask slipping further with each passing second. In that stillness, one thing became clear to me. This was no longer just about a house. It was about dignity. It was about respect. It was about showing her, and everyone else, that even a father mocked and betrayed could still stand tall, and the fight was far from over. The silence in the courtroom was unbearable. It stretched so long that I could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights, the shuffle of papers, even the nervous tapping of my daughter's shoe against the polished floor. The judge's face was unreadable, but his eyes lingered on the stack of evidence my lawyer had laid before him. Finally he spoke. I've heard both sides, and I must say the contrast here is remarkable. On one hand, I see a daughter claiming betrayal and emotional harm. On the other, I see a father who followed every legal and ethical step to exercise his rights. What troubles me, his eyes flicked toward my daughter, is the lack of tangible proof on your side. Her lawyer jumped in quickly, scrambling to regain ground. Your Honor, the proof lies not just in documents but in behavior. This man acted irrationally. Who sells a family heirloom, a beach house, without consulting the very child it was meant for? I could feel the heat rise in my chest, but my lawyer calmly countered. He didn't have to consult her because it was never hers. Property doesn't transfer on assumption, it transfers on paper. The deed was in his name, and the decision was his to make. There is no irrationality in asserting ownership over what is rightfully yours. The judge nodded slowly, scribbling something on his notepad. My daughter's face twisted with desperation. Her eyes flashed with that same fire I'd seen so many times growing up whenever she didn't get her way. She slammed her hand down on the table, ignoring her lawyer's attempt to calm her. "He's lying!" she shouted. "He promised me that house. Everyone knew it. He's just doing this to hurt me, to make me look like a fool." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the sound bouncing off the wooden walls. The judge raised his hand for silence, his expression tightening. "Control yourself, ma'am. Outbursts will not help your case." But she didn't stop. She stood, her voice rising with every word. "You don't understand. My whole life he's been trying to hold me back. He never wanted me to succeed. He never wanted me to have anything for myself. This house, it was the one thing I wanted, and he stole it from me out of spite." Her words were drenched in venom, and as I sat there, I realized how far gone she was. This wasn't just about a house anymore. This was years of resentment spilling out. A volcano that had been simmering beneath the surface, now erupting in front of strangers. The judge's gavel came down hard, silencing the room. "That's enough," he barked. "This is not a stage for personal grudges. This is a court of law." My daughter collapsed back into her seat, her face flushed, her breathing heavy. For a moment, she looked less like a powerful woman and more like the angry, spoiled child I remembered from her teenage years. Mr. Charles, my lawyer, seized the opportunity. He stood, his voice calm but cutting. "Your Honor, what you just witnessed is precisely what my client has endured for years: mockery, emotional manipulation, and entitlement. This case is not about a father's incompetence. It is about a daughter's inability to accept that not everything in this life is handed to her." The judge's pen scratched across the paper again. My daughter's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confidence shaken. And then, just when I thought she might regain control, my daughter turned toward me. Her eyes locked onto mine, and she hissed through clenched teeth, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "You'll regret this, I'll make sure you do." The words were venom, dripping with the same hatred I had heard before. My stomach twisted, but I kept my face calm. I couldn't let her see she was getting to me. The judge cleared his throat. "We will recess for 1 hour before I give my preliminary ruling." With that, the gavel struck again, and the room began to empty. As I gathered my things, my lawyer leaned in. "She's losing control. That's good for us. Judges don't respond well to theatrics." But even as he spoke, I couldn't shake the sting of her words. My daughter, the little girl I once cradled in my arms, was now my enemy, vowing revenge like a stranger. The hall outside the courtroom buzzed with chatter. Some looked at me with sympathy, others with judgment, but I walked tall, shoulders back, refusing to bow beneath the shame she wanted to heap on me. I had already sacrificed too much in my life. I wasn't going to sacrifice my dignity. What she didn't know was that the beach house wasn't just sold. It was secured in a way that would reveal everything about her greed. And soon, when the truth came fully into the light, she would understand that mocking me had been the biggest mistake of her life. For now, though, the war wasn't over. The next round was about to begin, and this time I wasn't just defending myself. I was preparing to strike back. The hour passed like a long, slow tide. I waited in the corridor outside the courtroom, the hum of conversation washing over me without reaching my ears. People passed, some offering sympathetic nods, others glancing with the thinly veiled curiosity that always surrounds family drama. My daughter and her husband were nowhere to be seen. They disappeared into a private corner, whispering furiously. I could feel the quiet confidence I'd clung to since the hearing beginning to harden into something more determined. This wasn't just defense anymore. It was a reckoning. When the gavel sounded and the courtroom returned to order, the atmosphere felt charged, like the moment before a summer storm breaks. The judge peered at the files on his desk, then folded his hands. "We will proceed," he said. "Mr. Charles, you may continue." My lawyer stood with a steadiness that steadied me. He motioned to a woman I hadn't noticed earlier, a neighbor, middle-aged, her hands wringing a small handbag. She took the stand, and I watched the small tremor in her voice as she promised to tell the truth. "Mrs. Albright," Mr. Charles began, "how long have you lived next to the beach house?" 23 years, she replied. "I know the family well." Then came the part that tilted the room. "Did you ever hear discussions about the house being promised to the daughter?" Mr. Charles asked. Mrs. Albright's eyes dropped. "Yes," she said simply, but not like she says. "I heard planning, late-night phone calls, her talking about making the house hers, about pressure on her father. I even heard her laugh once, saying, 'Dad will have no choice when I take over. He'll see it my way.' It wasn't a casual promise. It felt like a plan. You could hear a pin drop. My daughter's face drained, her fingers tightening into a white-knuckle grip on the bench. Her lawyer protested, but the judge allowed the testimony. Mrs. Albright's words painted a picture contrary to the narrative of a sweet, betrayed daughter. Instead, it suggested intention, a scheme of entitlement rather than honest expectation. But the surprises didn't stop there. Mr. Charles then called the real estate agent who'd handled the sale. A confident man stepped forward, his tie slightly crooked from the morning's hurry. He confirmed that the sale had been initiated by the homeowner and that every form had been signed willingly. Then casually he mentioned something that made my stomach flip. During negotiations, I received a private email from the daughter asking if there was any way to get ahead of her father legally, asking if she could be appointed as some sort of temporary decision-maker. I found it inappropriate and reported it to my office. He produced the email, and the court read it aloud. Is there a way to gain temporary control? He's getting stubborn. I need to secure the house. Can we expedite things? My daughter's face turned pale as the words echoed. Her lawyer tried to argue that such an email could be misread, but seeing it in black and white was damning. The judge frowned, eyes fixed on her. Entitlement shifted into a very different light, one of manipulation. The real twist came when Mr. Charles called for one final piece of evidence, a short audio file. I hadn't been aware it existed until that moment. It was from a small digital recorder Mrs. Albright had placed near her window months earlier, because she'd been suspicious about late-night discussions. The courtroom listened as my daughter's voice came through, sharp, confident, laughing, talking about how Dad will sign away everything when the time is right, and mocking him for being too sentimental to see the practical side. The way she spoke, the casual cruelty of it, stripped away any claim of shock or hurt she'd been presenting. There was an audible intake of breath. My daughter's husband's jaw clenched. People shifted, whispering to one another. Her claims of betrayal began to wobble, then fracture. The theater of victimhood she'd staged was collapsing under the weight of her own words and actions. Her attorney tried desperately to reframe the evidence as selective and malicious. He argued privacy invasion and questioned the recorder's admissibility. But the judge, clearly weighing the totality of the evidence, tapped his pen and asked for clarification. It was then that another fact came to light. The daughter had indeed reached out to several parties, making arrangements in advance. Contracts with contractors, furniture orders placed in her name, a line of calls to friends, all suggesting she had been treating the house as a near certainty. As the day wore on, the tide shifted unmistakably. Witness after witness, email after email, and that casual, mocking audio painted a portrait of someone who had assumed ownership long before any legal transfer, someone who had planned, maneuvered, and then, when the deed was executed by the legal owner, sought refuge in the language of victimhood. I felt emotions crash over me in waves: hurt, vindication, sorrow. Hurt because my daughter had stooped so low. Vindication because the truth was finally visible to others. Sorrow because the child I once knew had hardened into a person who would attempt to undo our entire relationship for a house. Yet beneath it all, a quiet resolve settled. This was not merely about property. It was proof that the bridge between us had been burned by her own hand long before I had taken a step. When the judge finally called a recess to review the new evidence, nobody left the room unaffected. My daughter sat rigid, her earlier bravado stripped to raw anger and fear. She mouthed something indecipherable to her husband, maybe a threat, maybe a plea, but her eyes met mine for the briefest moment, and what I read there wasn't sorrow. It was a stunned realization. Outside the courthouse, voices swirled with speculation. Some called her tactics cruel. Others wondered how far someone would go for a dream. I walked quietly to my car, the weight of the day pressing down, but in my chest a small ember of calm glowed. The truth had a way of making itself known, and in this slow, painful unfolding, it was beginning to do just that. The next morning the courtroom felt heavier than before, as though the very walls had absorbed yesterday's tension and were now pressing it back on everyone who entered. My daughter walked in ahead of her husband, her chin lifted, but I could see the cracks forming beneath her composure. Her eyes darted around the room, avoiding mine, and when she finally sat down, she clenched her fists so tightly her knuckles turned pale. I took my seat across from her, quiet, steady, and bracing myself for what would come. My lawyer leaned in and whispered, "Today is about clarity. Let the truth breathe on its own." His words sank deep into me, grounding me against the storm I knew my daughter's side would try to stir up. The judge entered, and the room rose. As soon as we were seated again, my daughter's attorney launched into a fiery argument. He painted her as a misunderstood child who had merely dreamed of keeping her childhood memories alive through the beach house. He spoke of family promises, of an unspoken bond between father and daughter, and he even tried to cast me as cold-hearted, someone who had grown detached from family ties. His words were emotional, designed to sway hearts rather than present facts, and I could see heads nodding in the gallery as he wove his story. But when it was my lawyer's turn, he didn't match fire with fire. Instead, he calmly walked the judge back through every piece of evidence from the day before, the neighbor's testimony, the email to the real estate agent, the audio recording. He didn't exaggerate, didn't add flourish. He simply let the weight of each fact stand. The contrast between the emotional plea of my daughter's lawyer and the cold, undeniable truth of my lawyer's case was striking. Then came the moment I'll never forget. My lawyer asked if I would be willing to speak, not to give testimony, because that had already been covered, but to give context. I hesitated, but something in me knew it was time. I rose, walked to the front, and faced the court. My voice felt heavy but steady as I spoke. I raised my daughter to believe in hard work, honesty, and respect. This house was a place where those values were supposed to be lived out. But somewhere along the line, she came to see it as hers, regardless of my choices or my rights. I never promised her the house. I promised her love, guidance, and a future. But she's chosen to mock that, to belittle me, and to twist what should have been family into a fight over property. I didn't sell the house to hurt her. I sold it because it was my right, my choice, and because I could not watch greed swallow what was once meant to be a home filled with love. My words weren't dramatic. They weren't rehearsed. But the silence that followed was more powerful than anything else that had been said that day. For the first time, I saw doubt flicker in my daughter's expression, not just doubt about her case, but about herself. Her lawyer objected, claiming my words were an emotional ploy, but the judge allowed them to stand as part of the record. And then the judge spoke words that cut deeper than any argument had so far. This is not about sentiment. This is about the law. And the law is clear. The owner has the right to sell his property. What I see here is not betrayal by the father, but a misunderstanding, or perhaps a willful misrepresentation, by the daughter. My daughter's shoulders slumped as though the air had been pulled out of her. Her lawyer tried to rally, pushing for a technicality, but the momentum was gone. Each attempt to paint her as the victim now sounded hollow. The more they spoke, the more obvious it became that her claim was slipping through her fingers. During the recess, I watched her storm out of the courtroom, her husband trailing behind, whispering urgently in her ear. She didn't look back at me once. In that moment, I realized the beach house was never just about a home for her. It was about control, about power, about proving she could bend me to her will. And now, facing the collapse of that plan, she was unraveling. When we returned, the judge announced that closing arguments would be heard the following day. My daughter's lawyer looked rattled, his energy dimmed, while mine remained steady, his quiet confidence filling the room. The hearing adjourned, and as people began to shuffle out, I stayed seated for a moment, letting it all sink in. I had walked into this trial feeling humiliated, mocked, and stripped of dignity by my own blood. But as Part 6 closed, something shifted. The balance of power was changing. No matter how painful the road had been, I could feel the tide finally turning toward truth. The following day felt heavier than the rest, as though the weight of everything that had been said in court lingered in the air like smoke. I woke up earlier than usual, sitting at the edge of my bed with the sunlight spilling across the floor, and I wondered how things had come to this. My daughter, the little girl who once begged me to push her higher on the swings, was now standing across a courtroom, trying to strip me of my dignity and paint me as the villain. When I arrived at the courthouse, I noticed the gallery was fuller than before. Word had spread. People came to witness the spectacle, eager to see a family tearing itself apart. The whispers echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls and clinging to me like shadows. My daughter entered moments later, her heels striking the marble floor like hammer blows. She didn't look at me. She didn't even acknowledge I existed. Instead, she walked straight to her chair, whispering fiercely with her attorney. The judge called the session to order, and the final arguments began. My daughter's lawyer, clearly aware their case was slipping, tried one last desperate angle. He claimed that my decision to sell the beach house was reckless, irresponsible, and evidence that I wasn't of sound mind. He hinted at senility, questioned my ability to handle finances, and painted a picture of a father who needed his daughter's oversight to protect him from himself. His words were sharp, biting, and designed to sting. I could feel the audience leaning in, some nodding, some frowning, and for a moment doubt crept into me. But then my lawyer rose. He didn't waste a single second on theatrics. Instead, he held up a stack of documents, bank statements, contracts, correspondence, proof that I had managed my affairs responsibly for decades. He pointed out my charitable donations, my clean record of financial dealings, and my careful planning. "This man," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the murmurs, "is not reckless. He is not incompetent. He is a father who decided, within his full legal rights, a decision his daughter didn't like because it disrupted her own selfish plans. And then he delivered the blow that changed everything." He produced a series of text messages, ones my daughter had sent to her husband, bragging about how she would manipulate the court, how she would take the house no matter what it took. Gasps filled the courtroom as those words were read aloud. My daughter's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing as though she wanted to speak but couldn't. Her lawyer stammered, trying to object, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a fleeting moment I saw not the arrogant woman who had mocked me, but the frightened little girl who once cried in my arms when she skinned her knee. But that image was gone in an instant, swallowed by the cold, hard truth of the present. She had betrayed me, and now her lies were unraveling before everyone's eyes. The judge leaned back, studying my daughter carefully before speaking. "This court does not take lightly the act of deception, particularly when it involves one's own family. What I see here is not a father unfit to manage his own affairs, but a daughter who sought to exploit the law for her own gain." His words were steady, measured, but each one struck like a hammer blow. My daughter buried her face in her hands. Her husband shifted uncomfortably beside her, his jaw tight, his eyes darting toward the exits as if he wished he could escape. The gallery buzzed with whispers, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. When the judge adjourned for the day, the silence between us stretched like a chasm. She didn't look at me as she left. She didn't speak, didn't even whisper. For the first time, her mockery was gone, replaced by something far heavier. Shame. As I stood to leave, my lawyer placed a hand on my shoulder. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we finish this." His words carried a weight I felt in my bones. Tomorrow would not just decide the fate of the beach house, it would decide the story that would be told about me, about her, about us as a family, walking out of that courtroom. The cool air hitting my face, I realized something. No matter how the judge ruled, I had already won a quiet victory. I'd stood my ground. I had refused to be mocked, refused to be diminished. And tomorrow, the world would hear the final truth. The morning of the final hearing arrived with an eerie stillness, the kind that settles in your bones before a storm. I barely slept the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my daughter's pale face as those text messages were read aloud. I heard the whispers, the gasps, the truth unraveling her carefully constructed image. Yet despite it all, a part of me still wished things had been different. A father's heart doesn't stop caring, even when it's wounded. I dressed slowly, deliberately, as though the weight of the day demanded a ritual. The tie I knotted was one my late wife had bought me years ago, a soft navy blue with thin silver stripes. She always said it made me look confident and trustworthy. I wore it not for the court, but for myself, for the strength I knew I had to summon. The courthouse was crowded when I arrived. Word had spread further, and people came not only out of curiosity, but to witness the conclusion of what had become a scandal. Reporters lingered outside, snapping pictures, jotting notes. I ignored them. This wasn't their story to exploit. This was my life, my family, my heartbreak. Inside, my daughter sat stiffly, her posture perfect, but her face betraying exhaustion. The shadows under her eyes told me she hadn't slept either. Her husband avoided my gaze, his hand resting awkwardly on her shoulder as though trying to reassure her, though his own fear seeped through his every gesture. When the judge entered, the room fell into silence. The air felt heavier than ever before. The gavel struck, and the final arguments began. Her lawyer spoke first, his voice trembling despite his efforts to sound steady. He tried to spin the text messages, claiming they were taken out of context, that they were nothing more than emotional venting. But the words were there, black and white, undeniable. His argument felt hollow, brittle, like a house of cards shaking in the wind. Then my lawyer stood. His voice carried authority but also compassion. "This is not merely about a piece of property," he said, pacing slowly. "This is about respect, about dignity, about the sacred bond between a father and his child, and how that bond was tested by greed and arrogance." He turned to the judge, then to the gallery. This man raised his daughter, provided for her, gave her love and opportunity. And when he chose to decide for himself, for his future, she mocked him, attempted to strip him of his rights, and plotted behind his back. He paused, letting the silence press on everyone in the room. "But he is not weak. He is not senile. He is a man who still stands tall, who still has the strength to fight for his truth." I felt every word settle into me, not like a weapon, but like a shield. For the first time in months, I wasn't just defending myself. I was reclaiming myself. The judge leaned forward, his eyes sharp but contemplative. He shuffled through the evidence, the contracts, the text messages. His expression was unreadable, and every second felt like an eternity. My daughter's hands fidgeted in her lap, her confident mask slipping further with each heartbeat, and then the judge spoke. "This court finds no evidence of incompetence or irresponsibility on the father's part. The decision to sell the beach house was his legal right, and he exercised it within the full capacity of his judgment. The attempt to challenge this was not only baseless, but it was rooted in deception and manipulation. Therefore the case is dismissed." The gavel struck, the sound echoing like thunder. For a moment the room was utterly silent. No whispers, no shuffling, just the stunned stillness of a truth finally spoken aloud. Then the murmurs began, growing louder, filling the chamber. Some shook their heads in disbelief, and others whispered words of sympathy. I turned my gaze to my daughter. Her face was frozen, pale, her lips pressed tightly together. Tears welled in her eyes, though whether they were from shame, anger, or sorrow I couldn't tell. She looked at me finally, truly looked at me, but there was no apology, no regret, only the hollow realization that she had lost. I stood slowly, my lawyer at my side, and walked out of that courtroom. Cameras flashed, voices called out questions, but I ignored them all. Outside, the air felt lighter, fresher, as though the world itself had shifted. For the first time in a long while, I could breathe without the weight of mockery crushing me. Yet even in victory, my heart ached. I hadn't wanted to defeat my daughter. I had wanted her to understand me, to respect me, to see me as more than an obstacle in her pursuit of wealth. But she had chosen mockery over respect, greed over love, and now she would have to live with the consequences. As I left the courthouse steps, one truth echoed louder than the noise of reporters and onlookers. Sometimes justice isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming your dignity, your voice, your place in the story. And though my daughter may have mocked me, the day had come when her laughter was silenced, replaced by the undeniable weight of truth. When I returned home from the courthouse, I sat quietly in my living room, staring out the window at the late afternoon sun sinking into the horizon. The glow stretched across the sky in shades of orange and pink, reminding me of the sunsets I used to watch from the porch of that beach house. My heart ached with memory, but I felt no regret. Selling it had been the right decision, not just financially, but spiritually. I had needed to let it go. What I hadn't expected was that letting go of the house would mean confronting the bitter truth about my daughter. I thought of her face in that courtroom, her eyes wide with disbelief when the judge dismissed her case, the shame that clung to her as the gallery whispered around her. She had mocked me, laughed at me, tried to turn me into a fool in front of the world. But in the end, it was her arrogance that betrayed her. She had wanted to control me, to possess something that wasn't hers. But the law and the truth stood on my side. I poured myself a glass of water, my hands finally steady, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. My lawyer called me shortly after, congratulating me again and reminding me that the decision was final, that no appeal would succeed given the evidence against her. He told me I had not only won the case, I had restored my dignity. His words comforted me, but they also carried a sting. What use is victory when it comes at the cost of your own blood? That night, as I lay in bed, memories of my daughter's childhood floated back. The little girl who once ran barefoot along the beach, who built sandcastles and shouted with joy as the waves chased her. I could still hear her laughter then, pure and innocent, before greed, pride, and resentment poisoned her heart. A part of me wanted to believe that girl was still somewhere inside her, buried beneath the bitterness. But the truth was hard. She had mocked me, abandoned respect, and treated her father as an obstacle rather than family. And now, the house she thought she would inherit belonged to someone else. Days turned into weeks, and the scandal faded from the town's gossip, replaced by fresher drama. People stopped asking me about the case, though I still felt their eyes sometimes, studying me with a mix of admiration and pity. I didn't mind. I knew who I was again, strong, capable, unbroken. As for my daughter, she didn't call. She didn't visit. The silence between us grew, but I chose not to chase her anymore. She had to face herself first, to reckon with what she had done. I hoped one day she would, but until then, I refused to carry the weight of her mockery on my back. Instead, I started to build something new. I traveled a little, visited places I'd always wanted to see but had put off. I met with old friends, reconnected with people who respected me for who I was, not what I owned. And though the absence of my daughter in my life stung, the freedom of knowing I had defended myself and won brought me strength. The beach house was gone, but its story remained. A story of betrayal, of greed, of a father mocked by his own child, and of a truth that triumphed over lies. It wasn't just about property, it was about pride, about reminding myself and the world that age does not mean weakness, and that dignity cannot be stolen. In the end, I wasn't the one who lost something precious. My daughter did. She lost her chance to stand beside me with honor. She lost the trust of her father, and that was something no court ruling could ever restore. So, as I sit here tonight, reflecting on everything that happened, I have one final thought. Sometimes life tests us in the harshest ways, but in those moments, we find out who we truly are. I was mocked, I was doubted, but I refused to bend. And in the end, I stood tall. And now, I ask you this. If you were in my shoes, facing betrayal from the very people you love, would you fight back for your dignity, or would you let their mockery define you? If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Mine Sweet Revenge. Because every story of betrayal deserves to be told, and every victory deserves to be remembered.